Welcome to Mr. Kellen Stories, my beautiful YouTube family, where we bring you this most emotional, suspenseful love story is filled with heart-melting moments, deep struggles, and a powerful message about love, race, and courage. Watch till the end for a heartwarming and lesson-filled conclusion. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more touching stories. New York City was a beast that never rested. It devoured the weak, rewarded the strong, and tested the endurance of those caught in between. The streets pulsed with endless movement, horns blaring, neon lights flickering, footsteps echoing off the cold pavement. People moved with purpose, their eyes fixed ahead, avoiding unnecessary interactions. In this city, everyone had somewhere to be, something to chase, and someone to impress. But beneath the surface of its glittering skyline and hurried footsteps, loneliness thrived. Maya Rodriguez knew that loneliness well. At 26 years old, she had learned that survival in this city required more than just hard work. It demanded resilience, adaptability, and the ability to hide the parts of yourself that the world didn't want to see. Born and raised in a struggling neighborhood, Maya had spent her life fighting to prove she was worth more than society had decided for her. But the city didn't care about her battles. It didn't care that she had dreams, hopes, and a heart full of unspoken stories. So she adapted. She found a way to make a living, not through law or medicine like the daughters of wealthy families, but through something just as valuable: her presence. Maya worked as a conversation companion. For $50 an hour, she provided warmth in a city that could be so painfully cold. Some hired her to escape the silence of their lonely apartments. Others needed someone to listen, someone who wouldn't judge, someone who could make them feel like they mattered, even if just for an hour. She never asked questions beyond what was necessary. She never let her heart get involved. No attachments. That was her rule. But rules were meant to be tested. One crisp November evening, Maya sat in the dim glow of a cafe, waiting for her next client. She had been booked for a 2-hour session, standard for first-timers. She sipped her coffee, scanning the room as she always did. Her clients varied: elderly widowers, burnt-out executives, exhausted single mothers. Then the door chimed, and he walked in. Ethan Carter. She didn't know his name yet, but there was something about him that made the air shift. He was tall, dressed in an expensive wool coat, his posture composed, but his expression unreadable. His sharp blue eyes swept across the cafe before landing on her, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a flicker of curiosity, a question left unsaid. Maya straightened as he approached. He didn't fumble or hesitate like some men did. He didn't look around nervously, second-guessing his decision to be there. Instead, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, meeting her gaze with an intensity that unsettled her. "You're Maya?" His voice was smooth, controlled, yet there was an edge to it, something restrained. She nodded. "And you must be Ethan." He didn't nod, didn't confirm. Instead, he studied her for a long moment before leaning back slightly, exhaling as if he had just made some kind of decision. Maya was used to reading people quickly. It was a skill that kept her safe in her line of work. And Ethan? He wasn't like her usual clients. There was no desperate loneliness in his eyes, no nervous excitement, no awkward hesitation. Instead, there was something else. Something harder to define, a kind of quiet storm. The cafe bustled around them, but inside that small corner, an invisible thread had already begun to form, a fragile, delicate connection. Maya had met countless men before, but this one felt different, and different was dangerous. Maya glanced down at her hands, suddenly aware of the way she was gripping her coffee cup. Something about Ethan made her uneasy, not in a threatening way, but in a way that made her feel seen. And that was dangerous. "So," she said, forcing a light tone, What brings you here?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He traced the rim of his glass, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he murmured, "I don't know yet." His words sent a strange chill down her spine. Clients usually knew exactly why they were there: loneliness, company, escape. But Ethan, he wasn't searching for temporary comfort. He was searching for something deeper, something even he couldn't define. And for the first time since Maya started this job, she wondered if she was in over her head. The city hummed outside, its restless energy pressing against the windows of the cafe where Maya and Ethan sat. Streetlights flickered, casting golden glows over passing taxis, and the low murmur of conversations mixed with the clinking of coffee cups. Inside, at a small corner table, Maya found herself sitting across from a man unlike any she had ever met. Ethan Carter. He was a name whispered in Wall Street's elite circles, a man who had built his fortune with ruthless precision. He had power, wealth, and influence, everything society deemed valuable. Not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that made her feel seen. Maya shifted in her seat, clearing her throat. "You're quiet," she said, offering him an easy smile, the kind she had perfected over years of dealing with strangers. "Most people don't like silence when they pay for my time." Ethan's gaze flickered, as if he had just remembered where he was. He exhaled softly, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. "Is that what this is?" he murmured. "Paying for time." Maya frowned. It was an odd question. That's exactly what this was, an exchange of money for company, conversation, an escape from loneliness. But the way he said it, the way his voice carried a quiet ache, made her hesitate. "That's what most people see it as," she admitted. "What do you think it is?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back, his expression unreadable. The cafe around them faded into background noise, the sound of the world rushing on without them. Then, finally, he spoke. "I don't know." 3 simple words. Yet they sent a ripple through Maya's chest, an unsettling realization that she had stepped into something unfamiliar. She had expected the usual conversation, where he was from, what he did for work, the typical small talk that kept the lines clear. But Ethan wasn't giving her that. He was giving her something else, something raw, something unspoken. Maya crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. "You're not like my usual clients." Ethan let out a small breath of laughter, but there was no humor in it. "I doubt I'm like anyone's usual anything." There it was again, that hint of something beneath the surface. She watched as he tapped his fingers against his coffee cup, his movements controlled but tense. He carried himself like a man who had been taught to never show weakness, to never let anyone see beyond the perfect mask of success. But tonight, that mask was slipping. "Why did you book me?" she asked, keeping her voice gentle. Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her, as if he was trying to decide if he should say the truth or keep it locked away like a secret. Finally, he said, "I don't know yet." Maya felt a chill run down her spine. She had met men who were lost before, men who needed someone to talk to. But Ethan wasn't just lost. He was searching. For what? She had no idea, but she had a feeling she was about to find out, and for the first time in her career, she wondered if she was ready for what came next. Maya's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, a habit she had picked up when conversations grew uncertain. But this wasn't uncertainty. This was something else, a shift, a quiet collision of 2 strangers who weren't meant to cross paths, but somehow had. Ethan's eyes flickered with something she couldn't name: regret, longing, a loneliness that even his wealth couldn't fill. He was composed, guarded, but there was a storm behind his expression, an ache buried beneath layers of control. "I don't usually do this," he admitted suddenly, his voice low. Maya raised an eyebrow. You don't usually hire people like me." Ethan's lips twitched, but he didn't smile. "I don't usually seek out company." His words held weight. He wasn't here for a meaningless transaction, for mindless small talk or forced laughter. He was here for something he didn't even understand himself. Maya had spent years perfecting the art of keeping her distance, of providing just enough warmth without inviting attachment. But as she sat across from Ethan, watching a powerful man unravel in the smallest of ways, she realized something unsettling. For the first time, she wanted to know more. Who was he beneath the polished exterior? What was he searching for? And why, despite every warning in her head, did she feel the pull to find out? The city roared outside, endless and unforgiving. But inside this tiny cafe, something unfamiliar was brewing between them. And Maya had a feeling it was only the beginning. The days passed, turning into weeks, and yet Ethan kept booking her time. Each meeting was different, yet eerily similar. Same cafe, same corner table, same air of tension between them. But something had shifted. It was subtle, unspoken, but undeniable. Maya had built walls around herself. Walls meant to keep emotions out, to keep clients from becoming more than just names on a schedule. And yet, every time she met Ethan's eyes, she felt those walls crack just a little. She knew his type. A man born into privilege, raised in a world where everything was handed to him, where money could buy comfort, power, and even people. She had spent her entire life fighting against men like him, the ones who lived on top of the world while people like her barely survived at the bottom, and yet he wasn't like them. Ethan Carter wasn't cold or arrogant, wasn't cruel or dismissive. If anything, he seemed trapped, like a man who had everything yet somehow had nothing at all. One evening, as they sat across from each other in their usual cafe, Maya found herself breaking one of her own rules. She asked him something personal. "Why do you keep booking me, Ethan?" she asked, tilting her head. He hesitated, staring down at his coffee before answering. "I like talking to you." Maya let out a small, humorless laugh. "You barely talk," he smirked, but there was no amusement in his expression. "You listen." It was such a simple statement, yet it held so much weight. Ethan had grown up in a world where emotions were weaknesses, where men were taught to be strong, not sensitive. His parents had expected perfection from him, had shaped him into someone who could succeed but never truly feel. Maya, on the other hand, had been taught the opposite. She had grown up fighting to be heard. Her world didn't hand out privileges, it took them away. She had learned the hard way that people like her had to work twice as hard to be seen as half as good. They were from different worlds, two sides of a coin that should have never touched. And yet, somehow, here they were. One night, after a particularly long meeting, Ethan walked Maya to the subway station. It was something he had never done before, and she almost told him not to. But for some reason, she didn't. The city around them was alive. Bright lights, honking cars, the distant sound of laughter from late-night bars. But between them, there was only silence. Then out of nowhere, Ethan asked, "Do you ever get tired of it?" Maya frowned. Tired of what? The judgment. The way people look at you like you don't belong. Maya's steps faltered for a moment. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected him to see it. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time she wondered if maybe, just maybe, Ethan Carter wasn't as blind to the world as she had assumed. Still, she forced a smirk. "You get used to it," she said. Ethan stopped walking. "I don't think you should have to." There was something raw in his voice, something that made her throat tighten. He meant it, and that scared her. Because for the first time since she started this job, she wasn't just a hired companion. She wasn't just Maya, the girl who charged $50 an hour. For the first time, she was just Maya, and Ethan was just Ethan. But that wasn't how the world worked. She forced a laugh. shoving her hands into her coat pockets. "You can't change how people think," she said lightly. Ethan looked at her, his blue eyes unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he murmured, "Maybe I can." Maya's breath hitched. Number, she couldn't let this happen. She couldn't afford to get attached. Because no matter how much Ethan Carter made her feel seen, she knew the truth. In his world, she would always be an outsider. And love? Love had never been meant for people like her. But as she walked away that night, she couldn't ignore the way her heart ached, as if it had already begun to betray her. Maya forced herself to walk faster, putting distance between them, but she could still feel Ethan's gaze on her back. His words echoed in her head. "Maybe I can." What did he mean? Did he actually believe he could change the way the world saw people like her? Did he think privilege could erase centuries of struggle? Or was he just another man who thought he could save someone who never asked to be saved? She hated that a part of her wanted to believe him. As she stepped onto the subway platform, she stole a glance over her shoulder. Ethan was still standing there, hands shoved into his coat pockets, watching her disappear into the crowd. He looked lost. She clenched her jaw, shaking off the strange pull in her chest. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to be his temporary escape, not someone he cared about, not someone who mattered. The subway rumbled into the station, and as she stepped inside, she whispered a warning to herself. "Don't let him in. Don't let this become real." But deep down, she already knew it was too late. Because when Ethan Carter looked at her, he didn't see a hired companion. He didn't see a Latina woman who had spent her whole life fighting to be respected. He just saw her, and that terrified Maya more than anything else. The cafe was quieter than usual that evening. The usual clatter of dishes and the murmur of conversations seemed distant, swallowed by the weight of unspoken words between them. Maya stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, watching the way Ethan's hands curled into tight fists on the table. His knuckles were white, his jaw locked, and there was something about the way he stared at nothing in particular that unsettled her. She had seen Ethan tense before, seen his carefully crafted mask slip in tiny, fleeting moments. But this was different. This wasn't restraint. This was turmoil. Finally, he exhaled a shaky breath and spoke. "Do you ever feel like you don't belong?" Maya's hand stilled over her cup. The question hit her like a cold gust of wind, slicing through every carefully built wall she had spent years fortifying. She could have lied, could have given him something vague, something easy. But there was something in his voice, a quiet desperation, that made her tell the truth. She lifted her gaze to meet his and said, "Every single day." Ethan's shoulders dropped slightly, as if those 3 words had given him permission to breathe, as if he had finally found someone who understood. Maya forced a small, bitter smile. "People like me. We never belong, Ethan. We spend our whole lives proving we're good enough, but it's never enough. And people like you." She hesitated, unsure if she should continue. Ethan's gaze darkened. "Go on." She sighed. "People like you. You have everything, yet somehow you still feel lost." A humorless chuckle left Ethan's lips. "You're right. But that's the thing, Maya. I was never one of them. I tried. God, I tried. But no matter what I did, I never felt like I fit the mold they forced me into." Maya watched as he ran a frustrated hand through his dark hair, his composure cracking for the first time. "They told me who to be, what to believe, even who to love." He let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "And for years I played along. I became their perfect son, their golden child. I dated the women they approved of, went to their country clubs, smiled at the right people, but none of it ever felt real." Maya's heart ached in a way she didn't expect. Ethan Carter was supposed to be the embodiment of privilege, a man who had never known real struggle, who had everything handed to him on a silver platter. But now, sitting across from her, he looked like a prisoner of his own life. And for the first time, she saw him not as a wealthy client, but as a man who had been caged his entire life. Maya swallowed the lump in her throat. So why keep pretending? Ethan's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Because it's easier to be someone they accept than to be someone they hate. Maya inhaled sharply. She knew that feeling all too well, the suffocating need to blend in, to not stand out too much, to not be too different. "I know what it's like," she murmured. "To feel like you have to shrink yourself just to fit into a world that doesn't want you." Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her, as if she was the first person who had ever truly understood. A beat of silence passed between them before he said, "But with you, I don't have to pretend." Maya's breath caught in her throat. She should have stopped this, should have reminded him that this was temporary, that she was just a woman he paid for time, that whatever he thought was happening between them wasn't real, but she couldn't, because deep down she knew it was real, and that terrified her more than anything. Maya knew she should pull away. She had promised herself that she would never let emotions get in the way of her work. But Ethan was different. Each time they met, he showed her another piece of himself, pieces he had never shared with anyone. He told her about his childhood, the cold, distant father who demanded success at all costs, the mother who cared more about appearances than emotions. He confessed how he had been expected to follow in his father's footsteps, to marry a woman from their social circle, to raise perfect children who would carry on the Carter legacy. But he had never wanted that life. He had never wanted them, and now, for the first time, Maya was seeing the consequences of a man breaking free from the world that had caged him. One night, as they walked side by side after another long conversation, Ethan suddenly stopped. "Maya," he said softly. She turned, and before she could react, he took her hand in his. It was the first time he had ever touched her. Her breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. His fingers were warm, hesitant, as if he was waiting for her permission. "I don't care what they think," he whispered. "I don't care if I don't fit in their world anymore. I don't care if they hate me for this." Maya's heart pounded. "Ethan," he stepped closer, his blue eyes searching hers. "I only care about you." Tears burned at the back of her throat. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to be his companion, his confidant, not his heart. But as he looked at her like she was the only thing in the world that made sense, Maya knew she had already lost the battle she never meant to fight. Because she wanted him too, even if the world would never accept them, even if love had never been meant for people like them. And for the first time in her life, Maya wondered if she was willing to fight for something she had never believed she could have. Something real. Maya knew this was dangerous. She had spent years keeping her emotions locked away, refusing to let her heart get entangled with anyone, especially a client, especially a man like Ethan Carter. Yet here they were, sitting in their usual cafe, their meetings stretching longer and longer. She used to count the minutes, watch the clock tick down to the end of each session. Now she dreaded the moment he would leave. And worst of all, she knew he felt the same. Ethan didn't book her just for conversation anymore. It was the way he looked at her, like she was something precious, something he couldn't bear to lose. It was in the small gestures, the way he remembered how she liked her coffee, how he waited for her to arrive, how he listened so intently, as if memorizing every word she spoke. She should have stopped this before it got too far, but she didn't. Because a part of her, a foolish, reckless part of her, wanted to believe in the impossible. One evening, as they strolled through Central Park, the crisp autumn air swirling around them, Ethan suddenly stopped. Maya turned to face him, her heart already hammering in her chest at the intensity in his gaze. He reached for her hand. It was a small touch, but it sent shivers down her spine. He didn't let go. "Maya," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "I don't want just an hour with you. I want more." Her breath caught. She knew this moment was coming. She had felt it in the way he looked at her, in the way he hesitated at the end of each meeting, as if torn between what he wanted and what he knew was impossible. Still, hearing the words aloud, hearing him admit it, made everything terrifyingly real. "Ethan," she started, shaking her head. This can't work." "Why not?" His grip on her hand tightened, his desperation evident. "Tell me why." She exhaled, trying to ignore the ache in her chest. "Because your world would never accept me." A flicker of pain crossed his face. "I don't care about that." "But I do," she whispered. She pulled her hand away, hugging herself as she looked away. How could he not see the impossibility of this? Ethan Carter belonged to a world that had never made room for people like her. He had grown up in privilege, surrounded by wealth and power, where love was dictated by status, where partners were chosen based on legacy rather than emotions. She had grown up in a world that taught her love was a luxury, a gamble she couldn't afford to lose. If she let herself fall for him, if she let herself believe this could be real, she would be setting herself up for heartbreak. But Ethan wasn't ready to let go. "Maya," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "please, don't push me away." She turned back to face him, her eyes burning. "I'm not pushing you away, Ethan. I'm protecting us from something we can't change." He stepped closer. "What if we can?" She let out a bitter laugh, blinking back tears. "You think love is enough? You think your family, your friends, the people in your world will just accept me? That they won't see me as some woman you hired for money? That they won't reduce me to someone who doesn't belong?" He flinched, because deep down he knew she was right. She sighed, forcing herself to stay strong, to be the rational one. "We come from different worlds, Ethan. And in your world, love doesn't break the rules, it follows them." Ethan swallowed hard, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "Then I'll break every rule for you." Maya's resolve cracked. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him, but the world wasn't that simple. And love wasn't a fairy tale. Still, a part of her was already falling despite knowing she had no safety net, no way to stop the inevitable crash. As they stood there, silence stretching between them, Ethan finally spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Tell me you don't feel the same," he challenged. "Tell me you don't want this, and I'll walk away." Her lips parted, the word sitting on the tip of her tongue, the lie she needed to tell. But she couldn't. She couldn't say it. Because it wasn't true. She did want this. She wanted him, and that terrified her more than anything. So instead, she said nothing. And in that silence, Ethan found his answer. Days passed, and Maya tried to convince herself that she could keep things professional, that she could pretend Ethan was just another client. But she couldn't. Because when he looked at her, it wasn't with possession or expectation. It was with something far more dangerous. It was with love. And she felt herself being pulled into something that she had sworn she would never allow. One evening, after yet another long conversation that left them lingering too long in each other's presence, Ethan did something reckless. He kissed her. It wasn't planned. It wasn't expected. But the moment his lips met hers, the world around them disappeared. Maya felt herself melting into him, every wall she had built over the years crumbling under the weight of something undeniable. She knew she should stop this. She knew this was only going to end in heartbreak. But in that moment, with his arms around her and his heartbeat matching hers, she let herself believe, just for a little while. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving, she was feeling. And maybe, just maybe, love was worth the risk. The moment Ethan's father appeared, Maya knew. She had always known. There were unspoken rules in the world Ethan belonged to, rules she would never be part of. The streets of New York hummed with the usual night sounds, but in that moment everything fell silent. The air between them turned cold, the weight of privilege and prejudice pressing down like an invisible force. Richard Carter wasn't just any man. He was the Richard Carter, a real estate mogul, a name that carried power, respect, and an expectation that his son would follow in his footsteps. His presence alone was enough to send a clear message. And the look in his eyes when he saw Maya? It was the kind of look she had grown up recognizing all too well. It wasn't curiosity, it wasn't concern, it was disgust. "Who is this?" Richard's voice was clipped, each word laced with disapproval. Maya didn't need to hear the rest to know exactly what he was thinking. He was evaluating her, judging her. She wasn't dressed in designer clothes. She wasn't the daughter of some wealthy investor. She wasn't someone who fit into their world. She was just a girl from the Bronx, standing next to his son, a man who was never supposed to notice someone like her. Ethan, however, didn't flinch. He squared his shoulders and met his father's gaze without hesitation. "Her name is Maya." Richard arched an eyebrow, waiting for more, waiting for an explanation that would make sense to him. Ethan didn't give one. Instead, he simply added, "She's important to me." Maya's breath caught. She had expected hesitation. She had expected a nervous introduction, but not this. Not this quiet defiance in Ethan's voice, this unwavering certainty. For a brief moment, hope flickered in her chest, but then Richard scoffed. "She's not one of us, Ethan," Richard said smoothly, as if stating an undeniable fact. Maya felt the sting of those words more than she wanted to admit. Not one of us. She wasn't surprised by them. She had heard them her whole life, spoken in different ways, with different words, but always the same meaning. She didn't belong, but hearing them now, spoken so effortlessly, so unapologetically in front of Ethan, it was different. Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "And what does that mean exactly?" Richard's eyes remained locked on Maya, sharp and assessing. "You know exactly what it means." His gaze swept over her, slow and deliberate, before he turned back to his son. "You don't know what you're doing." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Richard sighed, shaking his head. "Ethan, whatever this is, it's beneath you." Maya felt her stomach twist. Beneath you. She wasn't even a person to him. Just a mistake Ethan hadn't realized he was making. "Dad, stop!" Ethan said sharply. But Richard wasn't finished. He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough for the words to feel like a private threat. "You are risking everything," he murmured. "For what, some experiment?" Maya flinched. The word hung in the air like poison. Experiment, like she was some reckless phase. A temporary distraction, like she wasn't real. Ethan's entire body tensed beside her. "Don't talk about her like that." Richard exhaled as if disappointed. "I thought I raised you better than this." Ethan let out a cold laugh. "Raised me better than what? Than thinking for myself? Than throwing away your future?" Richard snapped, his patience thinning. "Look around you, Ethan. She doesn't belong in your world, and you don't belong in hers." Maya's chest tightened. This was exactly why she had been afraid. Not because of love, not because of her own feelings, but because she knew, she always knew, that the world wouldn't let them exist together. And Richard Carter, he was just the first shadow of a much larger storm. Maya could have defended herself. She could have told Richard that she wasn't some gold digger, that she didn't need Ethan's wealth or status. She could have said 1,000 things, but she didn't. Because what was the point? Men like Richard Carter didn't listen. They didn't see people like her as individuals with thoughts and dreams and worth. They saw labels, and Maya's label, in his eyes, was already decided. So instead she took a deep breath and looked at Ethan. He was furious, his body rigid with barely restrained anger. And in that moment she realized something heartbreaking. This was just the beginning. If she stayed, if she let herself fall deeper, this wouldn't be the last time she would be made to feel small. She had fought her whole life to build something for herself. Could she survive watching someone she cared about be forced to choose between love and the world he was born into? She wasn't sure. But Ethan wasn't letting go, and that terrified her more than anything. Richard Carter straightened his jacket, his point made. "I suggest you rethink your choices," he told Ethan, his voice cool, "before they ruin you." Ethan didn't respond, but the fire in his eyes didn't dim. Richard turned to leave, pausing just long enough to glance at Maya one last time, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. Then, without another word, he walked away. The moment he was gone, Ethan let out a shaky breath. His hands were still trembling. Maya reached for them without thinking, her fingers curling around his. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Ethan snapped his gaze to her, his brows furrowing. "What?" "I knew this would happen," she admitted. I didn't think it would happen so soon." His grip on her hand tightened. "Maya, this changes nothing." She wanted to believe that. She really did. But deep down she knew everything had already changed, and now they were standing at the edge of something dangerous, a battle against the world, a battle against expectations, against prejudice, against everything trying to tear them apart. Maya had spent her entire life fighting. The question was Ethan ready to fight too? Maya made the decision for him. She had to. The night Ethan's father confronted them, she saw something in Ethan's eyes: anger, defiance, love. But she also saw something else, a war he wasn't prepared for, a war against a world that would never accept them together, and she couldn't let him fight a battle he didn't even know the depth of. So she disappeared. She stopped answering his calls. She quit the job. She made herself vanish into the endless crowd of New York City, just another face in the sea of strangers. Because she knew the truth. He deserved a life without barriers, even if it meant breaking her own heart to give it to him. Ethan didn't take her silence lightly. At first he thought she just needed space. Maybe she was scared, overwhelmed. He understood that. But then days turned into weeks. Calls went unanswered, messages were left unread, or worse, never delivered at all. He went to the cafe where they had spent so many late nights talking, but she wasn't there. He called the agency she worked for, only to hear the cold reply, "She no longer works with us." Just like that, she was gone. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Carter felt completely and utterly lost. He searched for her everywhere. Through the streets of Brooklyn, the corners of the Bronx, every bookstore, every quiet coffee shop where she might have hidden away. But New York City was too big. And Maya? She had learned how to make herself invisible long before he ever met her. Still, he refused to give up. Every night he walked through the places they had been together, replaying every moment in his mind. Had he been too pushy? Had he made her feel trapped? Had his father's words scared her that much? The more he thought about it, the more he realized the truth. She hadn't left because she didn't care. She had left because she thought she had to. Ethan had always known he came from privilege, but he had never really understood what that meant, not until now, not until he saw firsthand what Maya had lived through. She had spent her life being told she wasn't enough, that she didn't belong, that people like her had to fight twice as hard for half as much, and she had learned over time that love wasn't always enough to change the world. But Ethan? He had never truly felt that before. Not until now. Because no matter how much he tried, how much he searched, he was still Ethan Carter, the man who had everything. Everything except the one thing that mattered most. Maya. New York hadn't changed. The lights still flickered in Times Square. The taxis still honked impatiently. The sidewalks were still crowded with people chasing their dreams. But to Ethan, the city felt different. It felt empty. Because for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to want something you couldn't have. He had spent years building a career, following the carefully laid out path his family had set for him. But none of it mattered now. Not if he couldn't find her. Not if she didn't want to be found. Ethan had hoped Maya would leave him something, a note, a message, anything, but she didn't. She had cut herself out of his life so completely that it was as if she had never been there at all. And that, more than anything, broke him. Because Maya wasn't the kind of person who walked away easily. She was a fighter, and if she had left, if she had truly disappeared, then it meant she had done it for him, to protect herself, to protect them from a world that would never understand. Weeks passed, and in those weeks, Ethan learned more about himself than he had in the last 30 years. He learned that love wasn't just about wanting someone, it was about fighting for them. It was about proving that they mattered. And he realized something else, something painful but true. Maya had been fighting her whole life. For acceptance, for respect, for the right to exist in spaces that weren't built for her. She had never expected him to fight too, because men like him, privileged, wealthy, protected, never did. But she was wrong, because Ethan Carter was ready. He wasn't letting her go, no matter what it took, no matter how long he had to search, no matter how many doors he had to knock on. He was going to find Maya, and when he did, he would prove to her that love wasn't just a dream. It was worth fighting for. Maya had told herself she wouldn't cry. She had made her decision. She had walked away from Ethan, from the world that would never fully accept her, but her heart didn't listen. No matter how many times she reminded herself that this was for the best, that she was sparing him the pain of choosing between love and family, her chest ached with regret. And that's when she did something she never thought she would do. She picked up a pen, and she wrote him a letter. It wasn't a long letter, but it was enough. Enough to say what she had never been able to say to his face, enough to tell him the truth. She held the pen tightly, her hand shaking as she wrote, "Ethan, I left because I didn't want to be your fight. I didn't want to be the reason you lost your family, but maybe love is supposed to be a fight. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I should have let you choose. But if you ever do choose, if you ever decide to stand against them, truly stand against them, you'll find me. Maya." She stared at the ink, the words bleeding into the paper as her tears fell onto the page. Was she making a mistake? Would he even care anymore? Would he hate her for leaving, or would he fight for her? Maya folded the letter carefully, slipping it into an envelope with trembling hands. She stood at her small apartment's window, looking out at the city she had always called home. A city that had never truly accepted her. A city where she had learned to keep her head down, to survive instead of dream. But with Ethan, she had allowed herself to dream. And now, she was about to leave her heart on his doorstep. The streets were quieter than usual. It was late, and the city's usual hum had softened into a low whisper. Maya walked slowly, the envelope clutched tightly in her hands, her heart hammering in her chest. Ethan lived in a different world than she did. His building was tall, imposing, luxurious, the kind of place that had doormen and cameras where people like her weren't usually welcomed. But tonight, she didn't care. Tonight, she wasn't just Maya Rodriguez, the woman who charged $50 an hour for her time. Tonight, she was a woman in love. She reached his doorstep, standing in the cold air, her breath coming in shaky exhales. His apartment lights were off. He wasn't home. Her fingers tightened around the letter, her mind racing. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe she should just walk away. But then she thought of his voice, his eyes when he looked at her, the way he had held her hand that night, as if he had been trying to hold on to something more. and before she could change her mind, she bent down and slipped the letter beneath his door. Then, without another word, without another glance back, she turned and walked away. Maya didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he would ever read her words, wondering if he would come for her. But Ethan never called, never texted. Days passed, and Maya began to wonder if she had been wrong about everything. Had she overestimated his love for her? Had she left him too broken to fight? Or worse, had he read the letter and chosen to ignore it? What Maya didn't know was that Ethan never saw the letter. That night, before he returned home, his father came to visit his apartment. Richard Carter wasn't a man who liked to lose, and he knew his son. He knew Ethan was still searching for Maya, still holding on to the idea of a life that didn't fit into their world. So when Richard arrived at Ethan's doorstep and saw the letter lying there, addressed to his son in neat, careful handwriting, he didn't hesitate. He picked it up, opened it, read it, and then he tore it apart, piece by piece, word by word, until Maya's message, her love, her final plea for Ethan to choose her, was gone. By the time Ethan came home, the letter was nothing but scattered pieces in the trash. And he never knew it had been there at all. He never knew that Maya had written to him, that she had wanted him to fight for her, that she had still believed in them. So instead, he stayed up that night, sitting alone in his apartment, staring at his phone, waiting for a message that would never come. And across the city, Maya lay awake, believing the worst. That he had read her words and chosen to let her go. Ethan had given up hope. It had been weeks since Maya left, and he had started to believe she never wanted to be found. But then he found the letter. It wasn't in his apartment. It wasn't waiting for him on his doorstep. He found it by accident, or maybe it was fate. That morning, Ethan had been searching for something in his father's office, a simple document, nothing personal. But as he shifted through papers in the trash bin, something caught his eye. Tiny, crumpled pieces of torn paper. With handwriting he recognized, Maya's handwriting. His pulse thundered. Frantically he pulled out every shred, every fragment, his hands shaking as he tried to piece them together. And there, between the ripped edges and ruined words, he saw it. "Ethan, if you ever choose to stand against them, you'll find me." His breath caught in his throat. His father had found it, and he had destroyed it. Ethan didn't hesitate. He stormed into his father's office, his fists clenched, his heart pounding with rage and betrayal. Richard Carter sat behind his massive desk, calm, powerful, cold, as if he had done nothing wrong. "Where is it?" Ethan demanded, slamming his hands on the desk. His father didn't flinch. "Where is what?" Ethan threw the torn pieces onto the desk. "This, the letter Maya left for me. You stole it. You destroyed it." Richard sighed, as if his son were nothing more than a child throwing a tantrum. "I did what was necessary." Ethan's vision blurred with rage. "Necessary? You had no right. You stole my choice." Richard leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Your choice?" he scoffed. "Ethan, don't be naive. That girl was a phase, a distraction. I saved you from making the biggest mistake of your life." Ethan clenched his fists, his nails digging into his skin. "You don't get to decide that." His father's expression darkened. "I have spent my life building your future, Ethan. I won't let you throw it away for some what?" Ethan cut him off, voice dangerously low. "Say it." Richard didn't say it. He didn't have to. The silence said everything. Ethan exhaled slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. For years, he had lived under his father's control. For years, he had followed the path laid out for him. But not anymore. Not when the love of his life had begged him to fight. He met his father's gaze, his voice steady. "You may have built my career, but you don't own my heart." Richard's expression barely shifted. "Ethan, be reasonable. I am. He stepped back. And I'm done. His father frowned. Done with what? Ethan's lips curved into a sad smile. With you. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking back. And for the first time in his life, he was free. Ethan didn't waste a second. Now that he knew Maya had never abandoned him, he had to find her. But New York City was huge, and she had disappeared into it like a ghost. He searched every place they had been together. The small cafe where she had laughed over coffee, the bookstore where she had traced her fingers over spines of novels, dreaming of stories that weren't hers, the park where she had once sat beside him in the cold, telling him about her childhood. But she wasn't there. She was nowhere. And then he remembered something she had once told him in passing. When I need to think, when the world feels too heavy, there's this little bridge in Brooklyn. It's quiet, away from the crowds. It makes me feel like I can breathe. His heart pounded. Could she be there? He didn't think. He ran. By the time Ethan reached the bridge, his lungs were burning. The city lights shimmered on the water, casting golden reflections across the quiet surface. And there, standing at the edge, arms wrapped around herself, was Maya. His heart stopped. She looked different, tired, worn, like she had given up hope, and in that moment he knew he had almost lost her. Maya sat in the small cafe, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. It was the same place where she had first met Ethan, but tonight it felt different, lonelier. She had convinced herself that walking away was the right choice, that loving Ethan wasn't enough, that their worlds were too different, their struggles too deep. But then a shadow fell across the table. She looked up, and there he was, Ethan Carter, standing before her, his blue eyes filled with something she had never seen before, certainty. Without a word, he slid into the seat across from her and placed a crumpled letter on the table. Her letter. Maya's breath caught in her throat. You told me to find you when I was ready to stand up for us, Ethan said softly. I'm here. Her fingers trembled as they traced the torn edges of the letter. She had never expected him to find it. She had never expected him to choose her. Ethan, she whispered, her voice breaking. Are you sure? His smile was gentle, but his voice was firm. I have never been more sure of anything in my life. Maya's eyes filled with tears. Maya stared at Ethan, her heart pounding in her chest. The letter she had written, words she never thought he would read, lay crumpled on the cafe table between them. She had walked away, convinced that their love wasn't enough to fight against the weight of society, of expectations, of prejudice. And yet here he was. He had found her. His blue eyes, usually so guarded, were filled with something she had never seen before. Certainty. You told me to find you when I was ready to stand up for us, Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I'm here. Maya's fingers trembled as she reached for the letter, her mind racing. She had spent weeks convincing herself that leaving was the right thing to do, that love alone couldn't erase the differences between them, that his world would never accept her. But if that was true, then why did her heart ache so much seeing him now? Ethan, she whispered, blinking back tears. Are you sure? I have never been more sure of anything in my life, he said, leaning closer. I walked away from everything, the wealth, the expectations, the family name. None of it meant anything without you. Her throat tightened. She had been fighting for so long against a world that always told her she wasn't good enough, against people who saw her as less because of her background, against her own heart that longed for things she believed she couldn't have. But here was this man who had grown up in a world so different from hers, fighting for her, fighting for them. Maya closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of everything they had been through. The moments of laughter, of quiet understanding, the stolen glances, the fears, the pain, and now, this, the choice. "I'm scared," she admitted. "This won't be easy. People will talk. Your family." "I don't care about them," Ethan interrupted. "I care about you." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I know we come from different worlds. I know this won't be easy, but I don't want easy. I just want you." Maya let out a shaky breath. She had never imagined a life where someone would fight for her this way, where someone would choose her despite the world telling them not to. Her heart raced as she looked into his eyes, searching for hesitation, for doubt. There was none. All she saw was love, and in that moment she realized love wasn't about race or status or privilege. It was about courage, the courage to stand against the world, the courage to fight for what truly matters, and the courage to believe that sometimes love is enough. With tears brimming in her eyes, she squeezed his hand and whispered, "Okay." Ethan exhaled in relief, a smile breaking through the pain in his eyes. "Okay?" Maya nodded. "Okay." And just like that, everything changed. The city still roared around them. The world outside still had its prejudices, its expectations, its whispers. But inside that small cafe, none of it mattered. Because for the first time in their lives, they had chosen each other. And that was enough. As Ethan lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her fingers, Maya knew this was just the beginning. No matter what came next, they would face it together. Maya felt the world around her blur as she sat across from Ethan in the small cafe. The warmth of his hand in hers felt real, grounding, like an anchor in the storm she had been trying to outrun. She had spent so long convincing herself that love wasn't enough, that their differences were too great, that the world wouldn't allow them to be together. But now, staring into his eyes, filled with a love so raw and unwavering, she found herself questioning everything she thought she knew. "Say something," Ethan pleaded, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya swallowed the lump in her throat, shaking her head. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't say anything," he said. "Just listen." His grip on her hand tightened, as if afraid she would slip away again. "I walked away from my father. I walked away from a life I was never really living. Do you know what he told me? That I was throwing away my future, that I was being foolish." Maya's heart clenched. She knew the weight of his sacrifice, the power his father held, the legacy he had turned his back on. "And maybe I am foolish," Ethan continued, "but if loving you is foolish, then I don't want to be wise." Maya let out a shaky breath. "Ethan?" "No, let me finish," he said firmly. His eyes burned with intensity, his fingers lacing with hers. "All my life, I've followed the path that was set for me. I played by the rules. I became the man my father wanted me to be. But I was never truly happy. Then I met you." Maya's breath caught in her throat. "You showed me a different world," Ethan said. "A world where love isn't dictated by money, where happiness isn't measured by status. A world where a person is worth more than the color of their skin or the wealth in their bank account." Tears welled in Maya's eyes. "Ethan, this world won't be kind to us." "I don't need the world to be kind," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just need you." Maya's walls, the ones she had spent years building to protect herself, began to crumble. She had always been so afraid, afraid of love, afraid of rejection, afraid of the pain that came with daring to dream beyond what society allowed her to have. But Ethan wasn't afraid. He had chosen her. And for the first time, she wanted to choose him too. A single tear slid down her cheek. "You're really willing to fight for us?" "I would fight the whole damn world if it meant being with you," Ethan vowed. Maya let out a soft, tearful laugh. She had fought her whole life, but never had anyone fought for her. Ethan lifted a hand, gently brushing away her tear with his thumb. "I love you, Maya, and I'm done pretending that I don't." Her heart thundered in her chest. She had spent so long running, pushing him away, convincing herself that what they had was impossible. But love wasn't impossible. It was right here. It was him. A slow, trembling smile spread across her lips. "Then stop pretending." Ethan let out a breath of relief, his own eyes misty with emotion. He reached across the table and cupped her face, his touch feather-light, as if he were afraid she would disappear. Maya leaned into him, closing her eyes. And in that moment, she made her choice. Love wasn't about where they came from. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about race. It was about the courage to stand together, and she was done being afraid. "I love you too," she whispered. Ethan's face broke into a wide, almost disbelieving smile. "You do." Maya laughed through her tears. "I do." In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the people staring at them in the cafe, not the expectations they were defying, not the whispers that would come when the world saw them together. All that mattered was this: them. Ethan stood up, pulling her into his arms right there in the middle of the cafe, holding her as if he never wanted to let go. "I don't care what the world says," he murmured into her hair. "I choose you, today, tomorrow, and every day after that." Maya clung to him, her heart finally at peace. She had spent her whole life believing love was a battle she could never win, but Ethan had proven her wrong, because love wasn't just a battle, it was a choice. And in this moment, they chose each other, forever. Maya felt her entire world shift as she stood in Ethan's arms, his warmth wrapping around her like a promise, one she never thought she would receive. She had spent so many nights wondering if love was worth the fight, if someone like her could ever truly belong in someone like Ethan's world. But the truth was, Ethan had left that world behind, for her, for them. As she pulled away slightly, looking up into his eyes, she saw something there that took her breath away. It wasn't just love, it was certainty. He wasn't here because of a fleeting feeling or an act of rebellion. He was here because he had made a choice. "You really left everything behind," she whispered. Ethan smiled, tucking a strand of her dark hair behind her ear. "Everything that didn't matter." Maya shook her head, disbelief washing over her. "Ethan, your father, he doesn't control my heart," he interrupted. "He never did." She searched his face for hesitation, for regret. But there was none. All she saw was the man who had fought for her, who had defied expectations and broken the chains of his past just to stand in front of her now. A lump formed in her throat. "I don't want you to regret this." "The only thing I would regret," Ethan said softly, "is letting you walk away again." Maya inhaled sharply, her chest rising and falling as the weight of his words settled deep within her. She had spent so long running, but in all that running, she had never asked herself the most important question: what if love was worth the risk? She reached up, placing her palm against his cheek. "I was so scared, Ethan." "I know," he whispered, turning his face into her touch. "But we don't have to be scared anymore." Maya felt a tear slip down her cheek. "This world won't be kind to us." Ethan smiled, wiping her tear away. "Then we'll make our own world." She let out a breathless laugh, something deep in her heart shifting, breaking apart the fear, the doubts, the walls she had spent years building. Ethan Carter, the man she once thought belonged to a world she could never touch, had walked away from it all for her. Not because she was an escape, not because she was different, but because she was his choice. His forever. A sense of peace, of clarity, washed over Maya as she let herself finally accept it. Love wasn't about where you came from. It wasn't about money or power or race. Love was courage, and Ethan had been courageous enough for the both of them. Now it was her turn. She smiled, tears still glistening in her eyes. So what now? Ethan grinned, his hand still holding hers tightly. How about dinner? Maya laughed through her tears. That's your big plan? Dinner? Well, he smirked, leaning in closer. I figured I'd take you on a real date this time. No time limits. No $50 an hour. Just us. Her heart melted at the memory. That was how they had started. Transactional, timed, structured. But now they were limitless. She shook her head, smiling. You're ridiculous. I'm ridiculously in love with you, he corrected. Maya felt her breath hitch. He said it so easily, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Maybe it was. Maybe love was never supposed to be complicated. Maybe it was as simple as choosing each other over and over again. I love you too, she whispered. Ethan's entire face lit up, as if those words were the only ones he'd been waiting to hear. And then, without hesitation, he leaned in and kissed her. The world around them blurred, the sounds of the cafe, the city, the whispers of strangers, all of it faded away, because in that moment, nothing else mattered. It was just them, two souls who had defied the odds, two hearts that had chosen love over fear. As Ethan pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, Maya closed her eyes and held onto him like he was the most precious thing in the world, because he was. You're mine, Ethan whispered, and I'm yours. Maya smiled, gripping his hands tighter. Yes, they belonged to each other, and no one, not society, not prejudice, not the ghosts of their pasts, could ever take that away. As they walked out of the cafe together, hand in hand, Maya knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what came next, because love had already won.